The sun was shining brightly on a bustling day in the heart of the city, where tourists roamed the cobblestone streets, cameras in hand, ready to capture the beauty and history around them. Among the crowd was a tourist, a young man from a distant land, who had always dreamed of visiting the royal palace. This iconic place, known for its towering walls and magnificent architecture, had always held a sense of mystery and grandeur in his eyes. He'd seen countless pictures and heard stories about the royal guards who stood watch with military precision, unwavering in their duties. Today, he was going to experience it for himself. Excited by the idea of being so close to history, he joined the throng of visitors gathered around the palace gates. They were all eager to take photos with the palace's guards, who stood still, seemingly unmoved by the noise and chaos around them. To many, the guards represented the heart of the royal tradition, an unshakable presence in an ever-changing world. The guards' uniforms were pristine, their postures rigid, and their faces were stone-cold serious. The young tourist, looking at the guards, saw them as nothing more than an interesting feature of the palace. To him, they were part of the backdrop for his vacation photos. He saw an opportunity to snap the perfect picture, one with the guard in the frame, looking like he was right in the middle of a historical moment. But as he moved closer, an idea began to form in his mind. Without fully thinking about it, he reached out and grabbed the shiny medal pinned to the guard's chest. It was a beautiful decoration, glinting in the sunlight. The tourist's friends, laughing and joking, egged him on. "Come on, do it. Rip it off. It'll be the best souvenir," they joked. The young man, caught up in the excitement of the moment and his friends' playful encouragement, tugged at the medal. The sound of fabric ripping echoed through the quiet atmosphere, and the once unblemished guard's uniform was now missing a prized piece of its insignia. The guard didn't move an inch at first, his stoic expression unwavering, but his eyes burned with anger. The tourist, holding the shiny medal in his hand, laughed along with his friends, feeling pleased with his boldness. He thought it was just a harmless prank, a funny story to tell when he returned home. Little did he know that the consequences of his actions were far from what he expected. Almost immediately, the atmosphere around him shifted. The guard's eyes narrowed, and he took a step forward. Within seconds, the young tourist was surrounded by palace security, who had noticed the disruption. The loud laughter of the tourist's friends faded as the situation became serious. The guard, still standing tall and silent, motioned for one of the security officers to take charge. The young man, realizing something was wrong, began to panic, but the words that were exchanged were in a language he didn't understand. He tried to explain, thinking it was all just a misunderstanding. "It was just for fun," he said, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean any harm." But the security officers were unmoved. The action of ripping off the medal was seen as a grave disrespect, not just to the guard, but to the country's traditions and history. What the tourist had thought was an innocent joke was, in fact, an unforgivable offense in the eyes of the public and the law. The young man was quickly detained, and the mood of the crowd shifted from light-hearted amusement to a heavy, uncomfortable silence. The young tourist, still holding the medal in his hand, felt a wave of panic slowly creeping in. What had started as a simple, carefree moment had quickly spiraled into something much more serious. As the security officers surrounded him, his heart raced, and his mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. He tried to explain again, his voice growing more desperate, but the words didn't seem to have the effect he hoped for. He didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation yet, and the more he spoke, the more the officers' expressions hardened. The palace security, experienced in handling such matters, wasn't swayed by the tourists' apologies. They had seen countless incidents, but this one felt different. This wasn't just any trivial act. The tourist had disrespected a symbol of the nation's identity and pride. The medal he had ripped off was not just a decoration. It was a prestigious symbol worn with honor, a mark of distinction for the royal guard, representing years of loyalty and sacrifice. To many, it was something far more significant than just a piece of metal. In the meantime, more officers arrived, creating a cordon around the tourist. The scene quickly turned from confusion to tension. People who had been walking by now stopped and watched the unfolding situation. Some whispered to one another. Others took out their phones to capture what they thought might become a viral story. The tourist could hear some of them speaking in hushed tones, discussing how the act of disrespect could have serious consequences. He looked around, trying to gauge the reactions of the crowd, but the growing realization of his mistake weighed heavily on him. A couple of minutes later, a senior officer approached, his demeanor serious and unyielding. The tourist tried once more to explain, his voice shaking. It was a joke. I didn't mean to offend anyone. Please, I didn't know. But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer nodded to the others, and they began escorting the tourist away from the scene. His friends, who had been standing off to the side, now seemed unsure of what to do. They too had started to realize the situation was far beyond what they had imagined. As they were taken toward a nearby holding area, the tourist's mind raced. He could feel the stares of the crowd on him, some with pity, others with disapproval. He tried to recall every detail of the moment when he grabbed the medal, what had made him think that this would be anything but trouble. There were no answers coming to him, only a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had never imagined that a simple, impulsive action could lead to something so severe. The officers led him to a small room where he was asked to sit. His hands were trembling, and he looked at the medal in his hand one more time, as if hoping it would somehow fix the situation. He could hear the faint sound of chatter outside the room, but nothing made sense anymore. How had a few seconds of foolishness led to this? And more importantly, what was going to happen next? It wasn't long before a different set of officials arrived to take over the situation. They asked the tourist a few more questions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation had already gotten out of his control. His heart sank further when he saw that the officers weren't asking about his intentions or his background. They were only interested in the seriousness of his actions. As the officials left to speak with higher authorities, the young man sat in silence, dreading what was coming. The sense of regret and confusion mixed with fear. He couldn't help but wonder, what would be the consequences of his actions? Would he be able to fix the damage he'd done? As the young tourist sat in the small, dimly lit room, the reality of his situation began to set in. What had seemed like a harmless joke only hours ago now felt like an irreversible mistake. His mind replayed the scene over and over, grabbing the medal, the laughter from his friends, and the shock in the eyes of the royal guard. Now, all of that had turned into something far more serious than he had ever expected. The room where he was waiting felt cold and sterile, and the silence made everything feel more intense. He tried to distract himself by looking at the medal still clutched in his hands. It seemed so ordinary now, just a piece of metal with some ribbons attached, but he knew it held far more importance than he could have ever imagined. To him, it had been a trophy, something to show off and tell stories about. But to the people in this country, it was a symbol of honor, pride, and tradition. And by taking it, he had not only insulted the guard, but disrespected the entire institution. Outside, he could hear the faint murmur of voices as people passed by, probably talking about what had just happened. As more time passed, he felt increasingly isolated, cut off from everything he had known. His friends, who had cheered him on earlier, were nowhere to be seen. They had likely been taken aside as well, and he wondered what they were saying about the incident. He was embarrassed, ashamed even. He had thought it was just a playful act, but now, the weight of his actions was too heavy to ignore. The officers who had escorted him here had not said much, but their stern faces left no doubt that this was a serious matter. The young tourist's thoughts began to race as he tried to make sense of everything. Could he talk his way out of this? Would he be let off with a warning? Or had he truly done something unforgivable? He wished he had taken the time to understand the culture and the significance of what he was doing before acting. He had been so caught up in the excitement of being in a new place that he had forgotten to respect it. Soon, a few more officers entered the room. They looked at him with a mix of curiosity and concern, as though trying to gauge the sincerity of his remorse. The young man had tried to explain his actions earlier, but he had a sinking feeling that his apologies wouldn't change anything. The officers spoke in a low, serious tone, and although he didn't understand every word, the gravity of the situation was clear in their voices. He could see the disappointment in their eyes. His mind shifted to the consequences that seemed inevitable. He knew that he had offended the royal family, and that couldn't be taken lightly. His thoughts turned to the news. He had already seen the headlines, heard the whispers of the public. People were furious. They saw this as an attack on their culture, their history, their pride. The tourists who had witnessed the incident seemed to agree. Some shook their heads. Others stood with their phones ready to document the moment for social media. His actions had turned into a public spectacle, and now it felt as though he was being judged by an entire nation. Just then, an officer returned with an official-looking document. The weight of the paper in his hands seemed to symbolize the decision that had already been made. The young man could feel the tension in the air. There was no turning back now. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear. His life had just taken a very different turn. The officer placed the document in front of the young tourist, who could see that it was not just any ordinary piece of paper. The way it was folded, the serious look on the officer's face, and the way the room seemed to grow colder made it clear that the situation had escalated far beyond what he could have imagined. The young man's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the officer carefully read through the document, and his thoughts raced. Could this really be happening to him? How had a simple, thoughtless action spiraled so out of control? The officer glanced up from the paper, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze. There was no anger in the officer's expression, just a professional seriousness. What you did earlier, taking the medal, is considered a very serious offense in our country, the officer said slowly, making sure the words hit home. The tourist opened his mouth to speak, but the officer raised a hand, signaling for him to remain silent. It wasn't the time to explain or apologize, it seemed. The tourist tried to swallow his anxiety and focus on the words being spoken, but the shock of the situation left him unable to fully grasp the weight of the officer's words. The officer continued, explaining in a calm but firm tone the laws surrounding the protection of national symbols. The medal he had taken from the Royal Guard wasn't just a piece of decoration. It was a symbol of the country's history, the royal family's legacy, and the honor of the military. Taking it off the Guard's uniform wasn't seen as a harmless prank, as the tourist had thought. It was an act of disrespect towards the monarchy and the traditions that had been passed down through generations. He could see the officer's point, but the young tourist still couldn't fully believe that such a small mistake could result in such serious consequences. As the officer spoke, the young man's mind began to race, trying to think of any way out of the situation. He thought back to his friends, how they had encouraged him, how they had laughed, never once stopping to think about what they were doing. He had followed along with their playful attitude, never once considering the consequences. Now, sitting alone in this room, he realized just how naive he had been. He had underestimated the importance of the traditions he had thought were just quaint little customs, something to joke about, something to take lightly. But they were far more than that, and the officer's words made it painfully clear. The officer's voice broke through his thoughts, bringing his focus back to the present. "This is not a small matter," the officer said. "You may think that this is just a cultural misunderstanding, but what you have done is more than a mistake. It is an offense against the nation's identity." The officer's words weighed heavily on him. It wasn't just about the Guard or the medal. It was about an entire country's pride. He was being judged not just for his actions, but for his lack of understanding. The young tourist felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the officer explained the potential legal consequences. In his mind, he had already pictured a different outcome, maybe a slap on the wrist, a quick apology, and then it would all be over. But this wasn't a trivial matter. It was a breach of trust, a challenge to the very fabric of the nation's honor, and the authorities were not willing to overlook it. As the officer finished speaking, the young tourist sat back, trying to take in everything that had been said. He was no longer the carefree traveler who had come to see the sights. He was a man in serious trouble, caught in a situation he had never imagined. What would happen to him now? Would he be sent home with a warning, or would he have to face the full consequences of his actions? The officer stood up, and the young man braced himself for the next part of the ordeal, uncertain of what the next few hours would bring. The atmosphere in the small room was tense as the officer stood up and turned toward the door. The young tourist sat frozen in his chair, his heart pounding. His thoughts were scattered, and he couldn't help but feel that the weight of the situation had already decided his fate. The officer hadn't given any indication of leniency, and the tourist couldn't shake the feeling that something much worse was coming. His mind kept drifting back to the day's events, how quickly everything had changed from excitement to fear. As the officer left, another official entered, this one dressed in a more formal uniform. He had an air of authority that made the tourist sit up straighter in his chair. The man didn't waste time with pleasantries. He glanced at the document the officer had left on the desk and then looked directly at the young man. "The act you committed earlier cannot go unpunished," the official said, his tone firm yet calm. "We understand that it may have been a misunderstanding on your part, but you've already been informed of the seriousness of your actions." The tourist nodded, still trying to comprehend the situation. He had heard the explanation before, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. However, the official continued, pausing to let the word hang in the air. "Your actions have disrupted the peace and disrespected a part of our national identity. It is a violation that we cannot ignore, no matter the intention behind it." The young man felt his stomach twist as the official spoke. He had never imagined something so simple could result in such serious consequences. A thought crossed his mind. Was there any way to make things right? Was there any chance he could avoid the full weight of the punishment that seemed inevitable? The official seemed to read his mind. "You will have a chance to speak at your trial. But I must be clear, this is not a minor incident. You have insulted our traditions, and the people will demand accountability." The young tourist's thoughts were clouded with confusion. A trial. He had no idea what that even meant in this foreign country. Would they understand that he didn't mean any harm? Or would they see his actions as an unforgivable disrespect? The official gave him a moment of silence, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving the young tourist alone again. Time seemed to stretch on as he sat there, trying to make sense of everything. His mind went over the events one more time. The photo with the guard, the medal, the laughter, a sudden turn to panic. He had acted impulsively, caught up in the moment. And now he was paying the price for it. He couldn't stop thinking about the public's reaction. The way the news spread like wildfire, how quickly people had condemned him for his thoughtless act. The eyes of the crowd, the whispers, the cameras. He had become a symbol of disrespect, an example of what not to do. He had become the villain in a story he hadn't even meant to be a part of. As the hours passed, the sense of regret grew stronger. If only he had known how important that medal was, how much it meant to the people here. But it was too late now. He had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The consequences were becoming clearer by the minute, and he knew that whatever happened next, his life would never be the same. His fate was now in the hands of the legal system. He had no control over what would happen, and all he could do was hope that somehow, some way, things would turn out better than he feared. But deep down, he knew it was unlikely. The damage had been done, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. The young tourist sat alone in the small, dimly lit room, his thoughts swirling in a fog of confusion, regret, and fear. Every minute that passed seemed to stretch longer than the last, and the more he thought about the situation, the heavier the weight on his chest became. The idea that something so seemingly small, taking a medal from a royal guard, had caused so much chaos was almost impossible for him to comprehend. He couldn't escape the image of that guard's piercing gaze, the crowd's shocked expressions, and the tension that had quickly built around him. He leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, trying to breathe deeply, but every breath felt shallow, as though the air itself was thick with the consequences of his actions. His mind kept returning to the moment when he had grabbed the medal, thinking it was just a harmless joke. He had no idea that the act would be perceived as such a grave offense. He had been in a new place, excited to explore, surrounded by the beauty and history that he had always dreamed of seeing. But in the blink of an eye, his innocent curiosity had led him down a path he hadn't expected. As the hours dragged on, the young man's thoughts turned to his friends. Where were they? Had they been taken away too? Were they facing the same consequences? He had heard nothing from them since they were separated by the officers. They had all laughed and joked earlier, encouraging him to act impulsively, not realizing that their carefree behavior had set him on a course for trouble. Now he wondered if they regretted their words, if they wished they had stopped him before he did something he couldn't take back. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and a new set of officers entered. The young man's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to expect now. The last time someone had entered, it was to deliver unsettling news. Would this be the same? Or would they finally tell him what would happen to him? He stood up instinctively, trying to gather himself, but his legs felt weak, his body drained of energy. The officers moved toward him, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a middle-aged man with short gray hair, stepped forward and handed the young tourist a piece of paper. He took it, his hands trembling slightly as he looked down at the document, hoping for some sign of mercy, some hint that he might not be sentenced to the worst possible punishment. The officer spoke in a calm, controlled voice, explaining the seriousness of the situation once again. "You've been charged with a criminal offense," the officer said, his tone making it clear that this wasn't just a routine matter. The young man tried to listen carefully, his mind racing. What you did, while perhaps unintentional, was seen as a grave violation of our national symbols. The officer paused, and the silence in the room seemed to hang heavy between them. The young man felt like he was being judged by the world itself. He understood the words, but the realization that his actions had led to such a profound consequence was still hard to grasp. He opened his mouth to say something, to beg for leniency, but the officer's stern look stopped him. There was nothing left to say, it seemed. As the officer continued speaking, the tourist's mind drifted back to his family and friends back home. What would they think? How could he explain what had happened? They had always known him as the responsible one, the traveler who respected different cultures, who followed the rules. He never imagined that one moment of thoughtlessness would result in something that could change his life forever. The idea of telling them what had happened made his stomach churn with dread. The officer finished speaking, and the tourist's mind went numb. He was being told that the punishment for his actions would be severe. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for a simple apology to fix what had happened. He would face the consequences, and no amount of regret or explanation could undo the damage. The young man's heart sank as he realized that he was no longer just a visitor in a foreign country. He was now part of a much larger story, a story that would follow him for the rest of his life. He was told to follow the officers, to go through the next steps of his punishment, and the weight of it all settled on his shoulders. It felt like everything was moving in slow motion as he walked toward whatever would come next. The world outside felt distant, as though he had been separated from it. The only thing that was certain now was that his life had been forever changed by one impulsive decision. The young tourist felt his legs grow heavier with each step, as though the weight of what he had done was physically anchoring him to the floor. His mind was spinning as he followed the officers down the narrow hallways. Each corner they turned only deepening the sense of uncertainty and dread that had settled in his chest. It felt as though the world had closed in around him. The bustling streets outside, the laughter of his friends, the excitement of being in a new place, all of it felt like a distant memory now, erased by a single impulsive act. He had hoped, at some point, that things might calm down. Maybe someone would see his regret and understand that it was just a mistake. But now, as the officers led him deeper into the building, all those hopes seemed futile. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was no easy way out. The public outrage had already been stirred, and the consequences of his actions had spread like wildfire. He had become a symbol of disrespect, and no apology would be enough to erase that. The officers didn't speak much as they walked, their silence only adding to the tension. He tried to gather his thoughts, but it was impossible. Every time he thought he understood the situation, it seemed to shift. The more he learned about the significance of the medal, the more he realized just how deeply he had offended not just a person, but an entire nation. The royal guard, the monarchy, and the traditions they upheld were all tied to something greater than he could have ever imagined. He had violated something sacred, and that truth made his stomach twist with regret. As they reached a large room at the end of the hall, the officer in front of him motioned for him to enter. The room was cold and sterile, and the sharp fluorescent lights above only made it feel more intimidating. There were no windows, no view of the outside world, just white walls, and the faint hum of air conditioning. It felt like a holding cell, a place where people waited for decisions that would change their lives. And in a way, he realized that's exactly what this was. He was waiting for the judgment to come down, for his future to be decided by the actions he had taken on impulse. He was told to sit at a small, uncomfortable chair at the center of the room, and the officers left him alone, their footsteps echoing as they walked out. For the first time in hours, the tourist was alone with his thoughts. The silence in the room seemed to press in on him, and he couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of regret that consumed him. If only he could go back in time and stop himself from taking that medal. If only he had understood the importance of it, understood that what seemed like a harmless prank to him was an attack on something far bigger. His mind wandered to his family back home, to his parents who had always taught him to respect other cultures, to learn and appreciate the differences in the world. He had tried to follow those lessons during his travels, but in this moment, he felt like he had failed them. How could he explain what had happened? How could he tell them that a single careless action had led him into a situation he couldn't get out of? The thought made him feel smaller, as though the walls of the room were closing in even tighter. The minutes stretched on, and with each passing second, the uncertainty of what would come next weighed more heavily on him. Would he be allowed to go back home, or would he face harsher consequences? Would the country he had come to admire now see him only as a mistake, a fool who had disrespected everything they held dear? He couldn't answer those questions, and the not knowing felt like a slow torture. His thoughts were interrupted when the door opened again. 2 officials entered, and the young man stood up instinctively. His heart was pounding, his palms were sweaty, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This was it, the moment when the consequences of his actions would be laid out for him. The officers didn't waste any time. They motioned for him to sit back down, and as he did, he tried to calm himself, bracing for whatever was to come. The door shut softly behind the 2 officers, and the young tourist sat in the small, cold room, feeling as though his entire life had been suspended in that moment. The officers, now standing across from him, looked at him with calm but serious expressions. He could tell that they had already made up their minds about what was going to happen. His heart raced as he anxiously waited for the decision, his mind still spinning with a mix of fear and regret. There was no turning back now. The official who had spoken to him earlier stepped forward. He was holding a folder in his hands, flipping through the pages with a quiet determination. The young man's eyes flickered to the document, trying to make sense of the words, but it was clear that they weren't meant for him to read. The officer finally stopped flipping through the pages and looked at him directly. "We have reviewed your case thoroughly," the officer began, his voice firm but not unkind. Your actions were considered a serious violation of national respect and tradition, and there are consequences for that. The young man felt a lump rise in his throat as he swallowed hard. This was it, the punishment he had feared. He had been bracing for something severe, and now he couldn't escape the reality of it. The officer continued, but the words blurred as the tourist tried to process what was being said. He had already heard this explanation many times over in his mind. He had disrespected the Royal Guard, an institution that symbolized the country's history and pride. He had taken a symbol of honor and treated it like a trinket, a souvenir. Now he would have to face the consequences for that thoughtless mistake. His mind flashed to the faces of the people who had witnessed the act, to the outrage that had swept across the city. He could still feel the weight of their judgment, and the thought made him want to shrink into the chair. But the officer continued, "We understand that you did not intend to insult or cause harm. You acted impulsively, without knowledge of the significance of your actions. This has been taken into consideration." The young man blinked, trying to keep his emotions in check. Had he heard that right? Could there be some leniency after all? The officer paused for a moment, then spoke again, his tone a little softer this time. "Given your lack of intent to harm, and the fact that this was a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate act of disrespect, the decision has been made to sentence you to a year of probation and community service. You will be required to perform a series of tasks to help restore your standing and contribute positively to this society." The words didn't immediately sink in, and the young man just sat there, stunned. A year of probation. Community service. It wasn't as harsh as he had expected, but it was still a significant consequence. He had feared being sent to jail, locked away in a foreign country for something he never meant to do. The thought of never being able to return home, of losing everything he had worked for, had haunted him for days. But now, the punishment seemed more like a chance to redeem himself, to show that he had learned from his mistake. Still, the weight of it hung on him like a chain. The officer gave him a moment to absorb the news before continuing. "During this period, you will be under supervision, and any further violations will result in stricter penalties. We expect you to follow the rules and show respect for our culture and traditions. Your actions have had consequences, but this is an opportunity for you to make amends." The young man nodded slowly, trying to process everything. He couldn't believe it. It wasn't a free pass, but it was far less severe than he had feared. He felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. He had been given a chance, but at the same time, he knew he would have to work hard to earn back any trust. The idea of community service, of giving back to a culture he had so carelessly disrespected, filled him with a sense of purpose. He would have to prove, through his actions, that he understood the gravity of what he had done. The officers exchanged a glance before turning to leave. The young tourist stood up, his legs feeling weak, but his heart a little lighter than it had been. He still had much to make up for, but for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. As he followed the officers out of the room, he knew that this would be a long and challenging journey, but it was one he had to face. He would learn, grow, and do whatever it took to make things right.